welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. This is one of the webinars in the BCS Health and Care series on health informatics or health information standards. I'm Mike Anderson. I am the lead for technical standards in the BCS Health and Care Executive. If you're interested in the work we do in the Health and Care Executive, you can find it on the BCS website. And if you're not a BCS member, we of course encourage you to join. My co-host is Tito Castillo, who is going to keep an eye on the chat. The way this is going to work is that Richard Kavanagh will give his presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A for the last 15 or 20 minutes. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat and we'll pick out the most interesting ones after Richard's given his presentation. The slides from this talk will be made available on the BCS website, and the recording will appear in a few days' time as well. If you're interested in the previous webinars in this series, they're all on the BCS website already. So I don't think I need to say any more than that. I'll just hand over to Richard, who will introduce himself and tell us all about openEHR. So over to you, Richard, and thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Mike. So hello, everyone. My name is Richard Kavanagh. I have been working in the healthcare standards area for quite some years now, 19 plus years, I think it is now, and have sort of circulated around the standards area in this space for quite some time. I've had quite a varied career, working, a large proportion of time working in NHS Digital and its former organisations, working with a team that set the standards for in England. I then flipped my role onto the other side of the fence, where I began starting a career implementing standards, both for the organisations I've worked for and then consulting, and now with Better, which is a curious position to be because my former life has all been around HL7 standards. Better brings into the openEHR, although we still do HL7 standards. And along the journey, picked up board positions at a number of different organisations, with openEHR, HL7 and INTEROPen. So well and truly invested in this standard space. There's some contact details at the bottom of the screen, and they'll be back on later on. There's going to be a lot to go through in this deck, and I'm going to go through it at quite a pace. So I'm not expecting everyone to take everything in. First of all, digest, as Mike says, these slides will be published afterwards. Feel free to reach out. If you have any questions after the event. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is go through very rapidly what openEHR is, what it's all about, some modelling approaches that is used in openEHR because they're fundamentally different to what you might have seen in other standards. Some of the tools available to help you get on board with openEHR and where you can access those. What a clinical data repository is, that's where you put all your openEHR content. And then when it's in there, how do you get it back out again? So how do you query it? That's the most important part. And then APIs, everyone loves to talk about APIs, and just really what APIs are available in the openEHR world. And then a little bit of my views on recent announcement versus openEHR and FHIR. Okay, so openEHR, what is it? So it's a specification. So openEHR isn't software, it isn't something you download, it isn't something you install. It's a set of open specifications. And in much the same way that FHIR is a bunch of open specifications. It focuses on clinical data models. So how clinical data models are defined, the process for defining them, what you do with them, how you store data from them, and how you manage them afterwards. The models and the specifications, like most open standards, are a collaboration between clinicians, industry, and health organisations, and the outputs are intended to be vendor neutral. So vendor neutrality and technology neutrality are a large part of the openEHR offering. So the whole intent of openEHR is to create these clinical models and have those made available for the community, but also to make the data open and freely available. So the openEHR standard features strongly in what people nowadays call open platforms and the open platform ecosystem, the components of which allow data to be stored, shared, managed in an open way. So openEHR is massively used around the world, and significantly in Europe as it happens. And I think we're geographically still in Europe at the very least. Within the UK, it's used across the London Urgent Care Programme. So it's an urgent care plan, I should say. So that's a number of different ICSs coming together and storing data for citizens across London. It's used within NHS Christie's for patient-related outcome measures. We just learned just earlier this week another region in Wales is using it for their EPMA system. So that's like a significant proportion of Wales now using it for EPMAs and others, and they're just the ones that my organisation's involved with, and I'm sure there are others. So, as I say, it's a specification and it's not a software product. But the specification itself, and I'm going to keep on making references to FHIR because I suspect people may have heard about FHIR more than people have heard about openEHR. So whereas you'll see FHIR and they have like release 2, DSU2 and STU3 and R4, openEHR isn't managed in the same way, so it's a more modular set of standards. And there's lots of different components in it, and they each evolve at different rates. So you'll see on screen there's a link. There's quite a few links in the deck as you go along, and you'll be able to access those later on if you so desire. But the modular nature of openEHR allows it to mature and to move forward based on implementation feedback. So here's a snippet of it, and then there's much more to it that's on the screen, but you will see it's kind of ranked in different or organized in different components, and each of those components has a version number and a status. All the specifications are online, and what I would suggest, you can't see it on screen, but higher up the page when you see it, there's some introductory materials, and if you're totally new to openEHR, certainly start there. Some of these documents, most of the documents actually, as you go through them all, will have kind of a summary section at the top of a document, and then I'll get down into the weeds and into the detail. Those of you who are technically minded will absolutely love the detail. There's lots of it. Those of you who are more or clinically, I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive, but if you're more business focused or clinical focused, then the summaries that should orientate you in the right direction. So lots of details online. We haven't got time in a short session like this to delve into that, but let's talk about architecture and how you would use openEHR. So what's it all about? So if we talk about a typical health system, and this is very simplified, and they mainly have a number of layers in there. So at the top, user interface, that's the bit that the service user, the clinician, whoever it happens to be, will interact with their system. And they're all different. If you've been around and seen clinical systems, there's a rich spectrum of clinical systems out there, all doing different things. And actually, having different user interfaces, having different is on one hand good, because it supports innovation and allows different companies to come and put their USP into how clinical systems should be managed. But on the other hand, you can argue it can sometimes be confusing for users to have lots of different systems. openEHR doesn't really go into that space. It's not concerning itself with user interface. But beneath each of user interfaces and each of the systems, there's an information model. There's the data that system is going to have. And that's where openEHR kind of says, no, there should be commonality here. Every system shouldn't have their own way of doing it all. And that's just because, you'll get proprietary models, you'll get semantically unaligned models between other systems. And openEHR suggests that there really should be common models across clinical systems. I've had at the bottom layer, excuse me, at the bottom layer, you've got the actual data stored, the persistence level. How are you going to store that? And of course, there are a multitude of different database technologies out there and storage mechanisms. And bizarrely enough, openEHR doesn't really care of how you store the data, at the physical sense, but it's more concerned about the abstract layer about that is, the storage layer should be able to deal with a common set of models and manage it in a common set of ways. So that's a clinical system, but of course, in any clinical enterprise, there's not a clinical system. There are people working in a trust or community centre or anything like that are going to be used to seeing many systems all having to work together, and many more than seeing on screen. That's I think many users would love to have that short number of systems on the screen. But each of these systems will largely have both different components, and they've all got to work together, and they've all got to talk together. And of course, within an enterprise, within an organizational boundary, you'll still get these systems communicating using HL7 version 2 or version 3, heaven forbid, or FHIR of whichever flavor, because there's several different flavors in use out there across the country. And they're fine to a certain degree, and that you can get them to work. But people know that there's interoperability challenges using those. So V2, as much as it is massively used around the globe, it's very variable. So even using the same version of V2, every implementer will use it differently. FHIR, once again, massively successful around the globe, but to mixed degrees, so especially when you get into the clinical content, openEHR, the EHR, electronic health record, it is mainly focusing on the clinical aspects of data storage. And when, if any of you've had the opportunity to see data stored in FHIR, rich clinical data stored in FHIR, what you will see is that there is no way around it than having to have lots and lots of different extensions in FHIR, and then you start to get a proliferation of extensions and different vendors using this, taking their own view on an extension. So not so long ago, I was working in Canada, and there was a renal system supplier there who came to us and said, hey, we use FHIR, we'll be fine, you can integrate with us. And then when we looked at their system and we started integrating with FHIR, yes, they use FHIR, yes, you could interface with it. But what we didn't tell us was the 180 different extensions that they'd added to FHIR to make their system work, because their system was, it was more like a facade around their current data system. So FHIR can work, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with FHIR, but when you get into that rich clinical data, it doesn't answer all the questions necessarily. But of course, you get data liquidity challenges where you have some systems that just have no interfaces at all, as in a messaging interface. And then how do you get to that data? Also in Canada, we had to do some data migration from systems, and they had no interfaces. No one understood the data structures. So that data was kind of locked within a system, and it's not a space where people of today want to be. So the open data platform comes along, and what was the ideal, the nirvana state is that actually each of these applications doesn't have its own information models and doesn't have its own data store, but they have a shared concern across all the applications. Now, clearly, you can't go from that previous image to this overnight. So there's a transitionary stage to get to that. But what we see increasingly now is that you can deploy a data platform, and then many different applications can use that same data platform. And that means within, and all along, I'm talking within an enterprise. I'm not talking organization to organization. That's the job of FHIR. So once you get outside your organizational boundary and you're talking to another organization somewhere else, FHIR all the way. No, I'm not disputing that. But within your enterprise, then there needs to be a way of making that data interoperability and that data liquidity easier. So what does that look like in real life? So the hypothesis that we have is that actually that data platform consists of two things. And you'll see I've put FHIR there, so a FHIR data store alongside an openEHR clinical data repository. We'll come on to what a clinical data repository is shortly, but for those who kind of thinking, hang on, this is all about openEHR, why is the FHIR there? And the reason being is because actually in practice, not just the organization I work for, but other organizations at openEHR, what they've come to realize is that actually the non-clinical data, demographics, organizational data, and some of the more transactional data, actually FHIR is really good at that. And the resource models largely describe what's required. So it doesn't suffer from that same kind of proliferation of extensions and all that kind of stuff. So why not just use FHIR? But it's really the space of the rich clinical data that's really where the openEHR CDR comes into play. So we talk about these data models, and this is a significant differentiator, say, between FHIR and openEHR. So openEHR has this concept which it calls two-layer data modeling, and it is significantly different from FHIR. So the thing that underpins openEHR, that kind of binds everything together and all the different technology components it has, is what it calls its reference model. So the reference model is the model of the EHR, in its totality. So it contains within it the data types you're going to use, the common data structures you're going to use, the representation of an EHR, and then how you can interact with that. Now you'll see on the screen, there is a section called demographics, because in yesteryear, there was a view that the demographics model should be represented in openEHR. And to be perfectly honest, it's not to say there's necessarily anything wrong with it, but certainly the vendors I talk to and people who I'm aware of kind of have this view now that we should have this mixed mode of using FHIR and openEHR. Not to say everyone will, I think in other parts of the country, then people still in certain areas are kind of using that demographic model. But it's definitely not as mature as the clinical aspects of the openEHR. So you have the reference model, and that describes everything. And then you have the level 2, which is the archetypes and templates, which we'll come on to very shortly. So the reference model is quite complicated. There's a lot of detail, and if you look into the documentation that I referred to earlier, you'll see lots and lots of UML diagrams that describe the various classes and the behaviors and the processes of that reference model, and that's what's implemented in software. So people who build clinical data repositories in openEHR, they have to understand that. They have to really understand that to build these CDRs, which are both functional and efficient. And people out there do, and there's quite a few choices of CDRs out there these days, and they're all using different technologies and different database technologies underneath. There's a multitude of different ways that people are doing that, but they all have to conform to the specifications that describes this is how a reference model, the openEHR reference model is described. So it's over the time that openEHR has been around, the reference model has been incredibly stable. Not that it hasn't changed, but it changes in very controlled ways at a very slow pace. And it hasn't suffered, probably because it's been around longer and it kind of didn't have the same uptake curve, maybe a FHIR did, of the churn that FHIR went through from the different releases. That's happened over 10 years or so that FHIR has been around. So that there has been more data stability and in those models. The fact that CDRs are all built around that reference model, then it gives you portability. So one of the sort of features of using openEHR and putting your data in a repository based on openEHR is, should you want to go between vendor A and vendor B, and they're both openEHR systems, then your data can largely move between one to the other without going through data migration, without having to go through complicated restructuring. So it's a much lower burden process. And then the interoperability within applications using that CDR is just a given. So we got to the level 2. So we talk about archetypes. So archetypes, the second process in modeling, takes the reference model and this, and builds it around a small kind of knowledge model. So each of the archetypes is a small segment of the reference model designed to represent a particular clinical concept. And there are hundreds of these, so as much as there are hundreds of them, there's many more to do, so because there's new parts of medicine and new parts of clinical practice becoming onto openEHR, then of course new models will be required. So these models are created, or these archetype models are created in a fundamentally different way to FHIR. So FHIR has, as people may have, this 80-20 rule where essentially, resources in the language FHIR would be created, covering 80% of use cases, and the other 20% would be dealt with by extensions. openEHR and archetypes come at it from a different angle. So what they say is that actually you should try and come up with a maximal definition of the archetypes to meet all the use cases. That's because you do not really want these archetypes to change too often, because you want them to be stable. You want them to be the underpinning models between these clinical systems. So to achieve that, there's a governance process which is used to take these models and push them through a process and iterations of review to get to a final state of an archetype that is of quality and has been through significant clinical review. Now that takes time. Obviously it takes time, and these things don't happen overnight. So in today's world, there already is a rich set of archetypes out there for systems to build on, and people can and do make use of the published archetypes because they're all freely available to build their systems for. But there will be time to time when you come along and say the one I need isn't there. So to do that, you can build your own local archetypes. You should try not to, and where those gaps are, then it's really beholden upon those people to engage with the openEHR community to fill those gaps in the sort of the more rigorously reviewed ones. So then you get templates. So archetypes and templates kind of live side by side. So a template is really a super archetype. It's still an archetype. It still applies to conforms to the reference model. But what it does, it takes these generalized archetypes and constrains them down to a particular use case. So in an archetype, you have lots of data elements. Some of them might be optional. Some of them might just say it's a code, but not say what code it is, so on and so forth. So it's a little bit like profiling within FHIR. So you can constrain things down and take that template and really refine it down to the particular use case that you want to be. So rather than it being a blood pressure, it might be a GP blood pressure, or it might be a cardiac surgery blood pressure, if there is such a thing. So you can refine them down to have only the data elements you're interested in, only the cardinalities you're interested in, and so on and so forth. So the archetypes and the templates, so the templates, sorry, other way around. The archetypes kind of are children of the templates. The templates themselves are what's loaded into the CDR, so the CDR is aware of what kind of things you're going to store in there. So it's quite complicated, the underlying language for describing the model. So in much the same way where FHIR describes its resources and profiles of things called structure definitions, but not many people understand what's in a structure definition. Same is really the case for openEHR. So there is a language for describing, archetypes and a model definition for an archetype, but most people don't need to know what that is. They can focus and let the tools do that for them. So we talk about tooling. So when it comes to archetypes and templates, they're complex beasts. No one wants to be creating that underlying, techie stuff to be creating those. So you need tools to do that. So in the land, and I keep on comparing to FHIR, in the land of FHIR, there's different ways of creating, say, profiles. You have the forged truth and Filey, you have FHIR shorthand, so on and so forth. But there's different ways of doing it all. There are desktop tools out there, for using openEHR, but they're probably a bit dated now. But instead, a number of years ago, an online tool was made available free to the community, link there, and anyone can create an account on this. You don't have to be a customer, you don't have to sign up to any, you don't have to pay for anything. You can kind of just sign up and get access to the tools. And the tools are really quite clever now. So they're very functionally rich, and they will guide you through the process of creating an archetype and a template if that's what you want. They're functionally very, very, very rich, and we don't have time to go through them now. But what I would say is for people who are kind of interested in this, then have a go, have a look at those tools. There is a help guide, that's linked off onto the documentation that shows you how to do that, and begin to understand just how that modeling works. From a technical point, it's not too dissimilar to FHIR. You have data elements, you have cardinalities, you have data types, and you combine them with terminologies. So there is some commonality there. So these models, once they're created, they can go into a system called CKM, Clinical Knowledge Manager. And the CKM platform has the same kind of visualizations as we just saw in the other tools. Actually, it was around before those other tools. But its purpose is not to create the models, its purpose is to govern the models. So it's the tool by which it kind of acts as a repository for the models. But more importantly than that, it's a tool that allows them to be reviewed and go through review cycles. And it's quite involved, about how that process works, but it's an incredibly important part of the openEHR offering, is that the models are of high quality and reviewed. Now, each of the models can be reviewed in its own right and are reviewed in their own right. So they're not part of a release cycle, because they all conform to the various underlying modeling technologies, then they can all be independently matured and progress in their own right. So then we get clinical data repositories. Clinical data repositories, that's where you put the content, so and in many ways it's like a very clever database, so you can put content in, you can get content out. So the content of an openEHR repository is something called a composition, and it's quite confusing really, because a composition in openEHR is not the same as a composition in FHIR. It's one of those things you kind of just have to understand it's different. So a composition has three major components. It has the actual data in the composition, and most of the time the composition will be what was in a particular template. But alongside the actual data that was in a particular template, then you have the context, so where was it done, what organization did it, what clinical setting were you in, dates and times and things like that. So that provides context to the data over and above the data itself. Also, with some provenance information about, who it was who put that data in, and so on and so forth. So clinical data repositories, the CDR standards define not just how you store that data, but how it's managed, how it's stored, how it's located and organized, so that the repository has functionality. It's not just a dumb data store. the whole presentation itself, that could be done on the functionality of a CDR, but suffice it to say, it's the place you put your data when you've been using openEHR. So where do you get a CDR from? As I say, the complex beasts, and all the information to build one is in that documentation I referred to earlier. It is not easy, and certainly I would not set out your voyage into openEHR by thinking I will build my own openEHR CDR, just like you probably wouldn't start FHIR by building your own FHIR server. So there are open source versions out there, and they're available for people who want to do that work. There are cloud hosting. I think AWS just recently announced that they have openEHR CDRs as an offering on AWS now. Or you can go to vendors who will do that as a managed service as part of an overall data platform. The thing to bear in mind is whichever one of those routes you go down, the CDR is not a clinical system. It's the data store for a clinical system. So you still have to have the application on top. You still have to be able to build all the other things around audit and role-based access and user interfaces and data, ETL processes, all the other kind of things. All together, they make that data platform. The CDR is the storage layer of that. So you got the data in. How do you get the data out? So openEHR has this concept of what it calls AQL, archetype query language. An archetype query language is really powerful, incredibly powerful. And it's one of the things that when I kind of discovered it, in my journey through openEHR, my mind was blown, so it operates very much like SQL. So those people who've kind of been with databases and used relational databases and used SQL, it's very, very similar in its nature. So people who use SQL will be used to seeing SQL statements with a select from, a from, and a where, and all that kind of stuff. AQL works in pretty much the same way. So an example AQL, as on screen, it looks quite confusing initially, but once you start using with them, it gets more and more clearer. And those who have been used to using SQL, it's quite a quick transition. The things to realize is that on the select statement, all these curious items and AT numbers, whatever, that's the path within a particular composition. So a bit like you get the dot notation in FHIR, this is the notation within openEHR. And then, you can either target your query on a particular individual's EHR, so for a particular patient, or you can actually go across all the patients if you want, or you can go for a selection of patients. And then, of course, you get some conditions as to what I'm particularly looking for. So once again, it's very well documented in the specifications, and all the vendors will support this, no matter which vendor you go to. Some of the vendors have added to it, because they'll support the base and then add some more features to it. And those features are part of a natural cycle to go through and say, is it useful, get the implementation feedback, and in due course they'll be folded back into the core standard. So moving on, another example, we can look at that later. So APIs, everyone loves APIs when it comes to standards, and openEHR knocks you out. You don't get one set of APIs, you get 3 sets of APIs. So why have one? But they're for different purposes. So once again, all described very well on the links I sent through earlier, and these are kind of more deeper links into there. So the first set of APIs is the APIs that revolve around how do you interact with that EHR, and how do you put new compositions in, to take them out, manage them, update and delete them, so on and so forth. All RESTful, all very similar to things that people have seen in other industries and other technologies. So then we get to the query APIs. We talked about AQL just a moment ago. Well, those AQLs you can execute via a query, so sorry, via an API. you can just append a query onto the API construct. So, you can kind of make dynamic queries if that's what you want to do. Or you can take those AQLs and you can kind of store them as stored queries within the CDR. So rather than having people just willy-nilly create their own queries, which might be quite a dangerous thing for people to do, you can come up with a set of libraries of those and make access to those. So every AQL you write, every query you write can become its own API call, which makes it really, really powerful for integration, because actually you can predefine all this and you can make it, to other vendors or other people building systems on top of your CDR, you can kind of help them with that heavy lifting. And then you have some definitional APIs, which is really about how to, how do you store the templates you're going to use. And as internal to the CDR, you can have folders and structures and stuff like that as to how you can organize content within the CDR. So that's probably a lesser used one for most people. But the EHR APIs and the query APIs, then massively so, and they're very, very powerful. So how am I doing for time? Ahead of time, that's unusual. So openEHR and FHIR, so there is a growing recognition that openEHR and FHIR would benefit from closer alignment, and that hasn't come by someone just dreamt it up one day. And that's because people are trying to do this. It used to be, and I was part of that world where openEHR and FHIR were kind of seen as competitors to each other, and kind, I'm not doing FHIR, I'm doing openEHR, I'm not doing that. And the world has moved on, and the world has moved on not because of the people necessarily who work in each of those communities, but through implementation experience, and that's the greatest influence that you have in the standards community, is implementers and that feedback. So back in May early this year, you'll have seen there was kind of a joint comm statement coming out from Graham Grieve, FHIR, and Rachel Dunscombe in openEHR, saying the same thing, but basically saying there's been an agreement for FHIR and openEHR to work together to achieve alignment. But what does that mean? What does that materially mean to people out there? Now, no one knows at the moment, actually, because there's the process to go on. So what I'm going to say is my thoughts, and these are my thoughts, and these are not my thoughts from either my engagement with openEHR or HL7 UK. These are my thoughts from living and breathing in this environment and working with these standards. So, first of all, FHIR and openEHR serve different purposes. They've got different purposes, different communities, but they clearly overlap. The degree to which they overlap is, I think, the thing which is going to be, the impact of that alignment. That the degree to which they overlap, I think, will increase. So, will the standards merge into one? No, I don't see that happening. And if so, I'll be long since retired by that point. So, not anytime soon. And on that basis, will the change be quick? No. Anyone who's worked in the standards areas know it's not a quick process. Things take time. Does everyone in each community agree with this direction of travel? No, they don't. And I know I've already met people who are going saying, "Oh, what's the point of this? What's it doing here?" Thankfully, from my engagement with people in the world of FHIR and people in the world of openEHR, they are by far in the minority. So people are looking towards this as a wholly positive thing. So everyone's kind of gearing up, everyone's kind of putting themselves in the right frame of mind to say, how can we positively engage with each other? And of course, what people are starting to do now, say, well, where's the low-hanging fruit? So what are the first things that we can do that are going to make a difference? The reality of standards, and this is a bizarre thing, actually, before I joined health, I couldn't get my head around this either, is if you look at HL7 and you look at FHIR, you look at openEHR, and most of the healthcare, they're built by volunteers. So nobody is paid to create standards, or very few people are paid to create standards. People do it alongside their day job in their free time as a hobby, or just because they're standards geeks. There's a certain amount of capacity and a certain amount of, just available resource that can move this forward, because as much as that alignment is going to happen and go, FHIR is still got its own stuff to do, and openEHR still got its own stuff to do. You know, so then somewhere amongst all that available capacity, people have to then find the time to work out how they're going to work together. So my thoughts, organizational, there will be drivers from the top. The respective high-level boards of each will, you know, make the right noises, and they will align things, and that's necessary. Now that's necessary so that the people in those respective organizations know that it's an agreed thing, it's an agreed direction of travel. And then you'll get the technical ones, you know, so both communities are, you know, very fortunate to have technically competent people who, you know, the toolsmiths who build the clever tools and do the proof of concepts and do all that kind of work, and they will start doing things. In fact, they already are, you know, even before this announcement came out. But they're going to do the things that they personally find interesting. They're going to do the things that they think, oh, well, it'd be good if we could do this. So left to their own devices, it'll be a bit like Brownian motion, and there'll be a lot of activity, but not necessarily a lot of overall progress, potentially. So commercially, there's never been much money in creating tools for standards. You know, very few organizations have managed to pull that off. So it tends to be volunteers or benevolent organizations who give time and resources to do this. And then the most important bit, and this is the bit where, you know, people on this call potentially can help, and others, is the user-centric world. So this is not doing it because it seemed to be a good thing, not doing it because it's technically, you know, interesting, but doing it because it's useful. You know, so now where, you know, the user communities which are, you know, looking to use both of these, you know, standards together, where are the gaps? What are the things that they find troublesome? What are the things where I think if only it could do this? And that's where I would ask of you, engage, excuse me, with, you know, HL7 UK or openEHR UK, or, you know, whatever your route is into those communities, and, you know, put your hand up and, you know, and voice, you know, what ifs. You don't have to come up with the answer, but you have to come up with the problem, you know, because then that will orientate people to think, there's a problem to solve. So, as I said, progress will be made. It already is. Now, people are already working on this and have been doing for, you know, several years actually, but probably not at the right pace. So my personal focus, no, my personal guess, should I say, of where this didn't happen, FHIR terminology. So the FHIR terminology services standard, you know, a subset of the overall, massively used, and you know, the openEHR community look at that and go, yeah, tick. You know, there really is little opposition to it. There is some challenge to it in that there's some functional areas that it doesn't cover off, but that's fine. You know, that can move on. Model to model transformations, boy, is that going to be difficult. You know, so and that's just because there is a significant semantic misalignment between the FHIR models and openEHR models. It's not to say that nothing can be done, but don't expect a click, it's transformed. The package management, the NPM process within FHIR, people in the openEHR community are thinking, oh, that's useful. So, you know, begin to look at how that could work. Smart on FHIR, you know, so the kind of authentication weight into FHIR. There's already work going on about smart on openEHR, you know, so how they, to make sure that they're in lockstep with each other and how they can kind of be created as one as opposed to competing things with the same name. You know, so implementation guides. openEHR is kind of doesn't really have an answer to this at the moment, you know, how you create implementation guides. And the answer, I'm afraid, is not, oh, we get the FHIR tooling and we add openEHR stuff into it, because the FHIR tooling, as much as it's technically great, aesthetically it's not, you know. So and you know, we met this in not in the UK but other jurisdictions where it doesn't meet accessibility criteria, you know. It kind of it's lacking from the people with design skills rather than technical skills. But there's the toolsmiths, I'm sure, will begin looking at that really good. The modeling tools, and this is kind of the flip and the reverse. openEHR has amazing modeling tools, web-based modeling tools. FHIR, unfortunately, no, it doesn't. It has tools, but they could be much better. So there's probably lessons to be learned in the other direction as to how to bring back to market. The semantic alignment, as I said before, they are different. Unfortunately, they're different by design. It's not they're unintentionally different. Just the philosophy of FHIR versus the philosophy of openEHR are really, really quite different. And then the big one, the governance processes. So how change is controlled and managed through openEHR versus how it's changed and managed through HL7 are significantly different. And as much as tooling side of things can probably get on without that, when it comes to aligning models, aligning semantics, aligning the processes by which these happen and how you keep them together, because several years ago there was a prior initiative to align some of the models in openEHR and FHIR, and a lot of people spent a lot of time doing that, and for a blink of an eye they were aligned. But of course, then they drifted apart again because the governance process weren't aligned together. So all of that, my personal view, I'm not to say any of it's going to happen. I'm not to say, but other things might come along first. But that's my guess. So very, very quickly, openEHR, there is an online community. It's a really, really friendly community. If you're stimulated by this talk and you think, oh, I want to know more, sign up. It's totally free, and as I say, people are willing to help you and bring you along. The specifications, as I said, they're all online, linked there. For those who are really enamored by this, the first international openEHR conference just happens to be in the UK. So that's in November of this year. There will be an amazing amount of information sharing going on there, and people showcasing how they've used openEHR and the benefits they've got from that. So if you're able to, I would suggest you pop along to that. What was that last one? Yeah, that was the last one.
Perfect. Thanks very much indeed, Richard. That really was a brilliant bringing to life of what you can find or out in the web and in all those resources. Really, really good. And it's good to know that volunteer activity in standards resembles Brownian emotion. You heard that one here first, folks. We've got time for a couple of very quick questions, but it's getting very close to 6. So I don't know which, I don't know if you can see them, Richard. There's only sort of 3 or 4 in there in the chat. But one of the first ones was CFH, NHS CFH had a look at openEHR 15 years ago. What's changed? Why should we be looking at it again now, I think is...
okay, so very briefly, so I was part of that process when we looked at it before. So there's 2 things. So when CFH looked at openEHR before, it wasn't looking at it to create CDRs and such. It was looking at it to say, how do we create models, knowledge models for other vendors to use in their systems, back in the day. Now, there's a couple of challenges with that. So one is openEHR wasn't as mature back then as it was now. I mean, that must easily be 10+ years ago. And secondly, because of the contractual nature of the national programme for IT, all the vendors said, openEHR, that's not on the contract, we're not doing that. And it was quite difficult at that point in time because the understanding of openEHR wasn't as mature, the tooling around it wasn't as mature, and there really wasn't that pull from the community and from vendors and suppliers to be able to do that. So I think time's moved on. I think the world's a different place. There's a lot more sort of references and referenceability of openEHR now, where it's being used at scale around the world. So I think the world's a different shape.
Okay, brilliant. So there's a couple of interrelated questions. One is from Eric. Does openEHR manage multiple locales easily? And far, there are many ways to do it and become fairly complex to manage multiple languages for definitions and instance resources. And then there's a question from Elena Platt, which is, given openEHR provides standards for data persistence and storage, does this pose issues in terms of scalability or issues in terms of limiting the use of other internal data models, such as event-based architectures. So I don't know if you can pick.
Okay, so first of all, so open-air models are from design support multiple languages, so and if you were to go into CKM or whatever and have a look at some of them, you'll see that they are translated into many languages. Depends on volunteer activity as who's going to offer to translate a certain one to a certain language, but most are in multiple languages from the get-go. And that's and I know in FHIR you can add extensions and you can do all that kind of stuff, but it's kind of a bit of an afterthought, whereas openEHR it's there from the get-go. So as far as the openEHR and does it support event-based architectures? Does it support other mechanisms? Absolutely it does. So the standards are kind of saying this is the minimum that your CDR needs to do. There's nothing to say you can't do more. And this is the evolving nature of the openEHR standards. So I mean, I can only talk for better, so in better on our CDRs, we have Kafka event streaming on everything that happens on those repositories in both the FHIR and the openEHR CDRs. So it's totally possible.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think there's one comment that I'd just like to highlight in here, which is from Jonathan Telfer, who a lot of you will know, and that's about how this can be progressed. You can probably see it at the bottom of the chat there, Richard. I don't know if you want to respond to that one, because that's a sort of broader openEHR thing rather than just what you do. And then there's one from John George. Does ADL being only used by openEHR pose a barrier of entry to new IT suppliers wanting to work with openEHR? What has the openEHR community done to address this?
Okay, so two things. I'll take the second one first because that's the easier one.
So
as far as ADL goes, ADL, I mean, there's two versions of ADL. There's 1.4 and version 2 as it happens. But I would say, to John George and the rest of his team in the team formerly known as the IOPS team, then how many in the team natively understood the content of structure definition within FHIR? And I would suggest that many of them didn't. And that's because you don't need to, because the tools do that for you. You don't need to know about ADL to do the tools. To build archetypes, that's what the tools take care of. If you want to build tools that create models, then yeah, absolutely, you'll need to know about that. But 99.9% of people use the tools, it's hidden from you. You don't need to know about it. So from Jonathan's question, national interop, so that's a big question, so and I would suggest the way to look at it is to pick an area of the landscape as a starting point. You're not going to do this all in one go. So for example, and once again, this is just my viewpoint, so if you look at medication management, so probably, I don't know, 80% of Wales is now using openEHR EPMA systems. But why could that not become the model of representation for medications across England? If you look at, there's several NHS organisations that we work with and other organisations that not better work with are doing PROMS-based solutions based on openEHR. If you look on, there's other people who are looking to use openEHR in more specialisms, whether it's around cancer care, which we're doing some work with Christie's on. So choose an area and focus on that rather than trying to do it across the board, because there'll just be too much to do at once. Choose an area, get the processes established, work out how to create the models, where to put the models, how to bring it, how to build the ecosystem that goes around that, and kind of take it from there. Would be my take.
Okay, I think we can just about fit in one final question, and that is, does openEHR have any known issues with handling and storing metadata?
Well, it depends what you mean by metadata, but so I would say no. depends on John's definition of what the metadata is. But it has metadata in the models to describe the models. It has metadata in the CDRs to understand, the nature of how things are stored in there. There's metadata everywhere within the openEHR world. So without more precision on what is intended by metadata, then I can't precisely answer it, but I would probably say the answer is no.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So I think we need to wrap it up there. Tito, is there anything that I've missed in the chat that is burning, do you think?
Well, there was a question about slicing in FHIR being an issue.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. Is slicing in FHIR still an issue in transforming between FHIR and openEHR?
I have no idea, I'm afraid.
Well, that's fair enough. Okay. Well, I think it's time to draw it to a close now. So a huge thanks to Richard for what I thought was an outstanding talk. Really, really informative, brought the subject to life, which is what we need to get people's interest and get things going. So many, many thanks to Richard for that. Many thanks to those of you who have attended. We much appreciate that as well. We're hoping to run some more standards webinars in the autumn and winter. So we'll keep an eye out for the information on that. And in the meantime, thanks again and see you next time.